I got the remedy. I got the perfect lyrical remedy.
Sup, I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. You can buy most of that shit that I make over at post-mort.com. Hope to see you there. Villains. Enemies. The big evil guy. The big bad. It can be a bit of a difficult topic in modern role-playing games. A lot of people seem to want to do away with the very concept of evil or difficulty or horrible things being done even to non-player characters, let alone their characters. So how can you create a villain in this atmosphere? What is the problem behind it? What are the different types of villain? How can you add a bit of depth to your villains? We'll try and examine that. But first, a little bit of grounding, really. Now, in reality, morality is grey. It is relative. There's very little that you can point to as being a universal value. And the vast and overwhelming majority of people accept this in this day and age. Even the softer wings of the various religions will accept that other people have other beliefs that are perhaps as valid or as justified as theirs are. There may be a genuine, material, moral reality. If that exists, it's likely to come from our evolutionary past, from behaviours that have been selected for. Sam Harris explores this in his moral landscape idea. There's a very good TED talk about that, and it's quite interesting to look at. But still, where there remains subjectivity and choice, then there are different moralities. Your modern Western moral reality is not the same as, say, an Aztec priest prior to the invasion of the Spanish and so on. Some people see in history, they see sacrifice, human sacrifice, as being a moral good for the betterment of all by appeasing the gods or paying them off or whatever else, something that we would just about universally accept as being a bad idea today. And from Harris's more objective view of morality in an evolutionary context, I think we would all say that that is bad, but it is excused by being reframed as being altruistic and meaningful. So there are things to be learned there that can enhance your games if you want to delve into psychology and morality and ethics. I know people don't like it when I say that word, but ethics are important. And this can all inform your game depending how deep you want to go into it. And the modern audience is very much morally relative. And some of them will reject the idea of an objective good and evil. But the thing about fantasy worlds is that they're not the real world, and we can explore different ideas, different physics, different metaphysics, different moral schema that different groups and characters might have developed around themselves. This moral relativism has been with us a long time, I think, longer than people appreciate, because most modern heroes are anti-heroes. Now, an anti-hero is not a villain or a villain doing the right thing. It's a hero who doesn't fit the conventional mold of a hero. Someone like Wolverine is an anti-hero because he's violent and frenzied and angry and surly, but he ends up doing the right thing. Or even Spider-Man isn't really a hero. He's more of an anti-hero because his main identity, his true identity, is a nerd. That's not a very heroic trait, certainly not at the time he was created. So it's useful to have these kind of things in mind when you consider your audience, your players, over what kind of villain you want to create. The most basic type of villain is probably the mustache-twirler. And this is most, or at least many, fantasy villains. They do evil for evil's sake. And this is normally rooted in the moral reality of the setting. In Dungeons and Dragons, for example, at least for the time being, good and evil, law and chaos, these are not subjective positions on morality or ethics. These are powerful metaphysical realities. There are realms that are good. There are realms that are evil. There are gods that are good. There are gods that are evil. And that is something that is reflected in many real-world religious ideas, though non-Christian ones tend to be, well, non-Abrahamic ones tend to be a little bit more flexible on that. Is Loki a villain? Kind of. Most of the time, or at least a trickster, but is he actively evil? Don't know. What about Satan? Well, Satanists might argue otherwise, but Christians would certainly argue that Satan represents unambiguous evil. So in these realms where these things are realities and not subjective, and not subject to debate and discussion and, oh, well, your ideas are just as valid as mine, the mustache twirler makes a lot more sense. And that it creates a kind of hidden depth that a lot of people don't anticipate or expect in these settings, because it fits into that underlying metaphysical warp and weft of the reality that is being created. If there are evil gods, if evil is a genuine force, if you can channel it and use it, then there are reasons for it to manifest. There are reasons for people to pursue it, to gain the favor of those evil gods, to gain power. And if we've learned nothing from Star Wars, if we've learned anything from Star Wars, it is that the dark side is easier. And those kind of black and white, mustache-twirling villains are certainly good for quick hooks, or for high fantasy, high adventure, where you want good and evil to be completely unambiguous. In the real world, you don't tend to really get mustache twirlers. Perhaps the closest thing you might get would be psychotic serial killers who are driven to do evil. There aren't really reasons for it, but there might be motivations or personal damage behind it. But that's probably about as close as you get to unambiguous evil in the real world, or any grounded, gritty or modern setting. Psychopathy is the closest you get to mustache twirling. Sociopathy. There are villains who have a different morality to you. And this is the more nuanced, morally relative position, except that you are in opposition with this different morality. There is some kind of reason for conflict, the clash of ideals, perhaps. Different political ideals, different religious ideals, different ideological or philosophical ideals or beliefs. For example, you might take an extreme position on ecological issues and therefore be a Malthusian terrorist. You know, their morality is different, their motivation is different. They want to eradicate the majority of the human population, not because they're evil and necessarily want to kill people, but because they recognize that the sheer number of humanity is putting such a huge strain on the earth that if anything is going to survive, humans need to be curtailed. Right? So that's a kind of different morality, a greater good, perhaps. Or perhaps you represent two aspects of a different religion, both of whom believe that they're the right interpretation, the right kind of religion, following the true God, and the others are filthy heretics who deserve to be burned at the stake because it's actively dangerous that their beliefs are being spread. The clashes between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, for example, would fit into these kind of ideas, with each side representing the other as evil and just having not too different interpretations of the same scripture. Another example of a different morality would be amorality, having no moral scheme or structure and just doing whatever is expedient, or indifference. And this is the horror behind a lot of the Cthulhu mythos. These great entities don't really care about what the gnats and the ants are up to. They just act, and it doesn't matter what damage they cause in the way that they act. They don't even really notice they're cultists to any particular degree. So cosmic indifference by a greater power or an unthinking force can also create a villain grey goo nanites, perhaps, or a huge hive of giant ants that overruns an area. You know, they don't have enough intelligence to care about who or what you are. You're just prey. A motivated villain is another type of villain. Perhaps they want to accrue wealth. Perhaps they just want personal gain of some other kind. They're seeking revenge, or they're seeking power. But in a nuanced setting, these people will have self-justifications for why they do these things, why it's acceptable that they do these things, that perhaps they can do more good with enough power, or other people don't deserve what they have. Perhaps they've had a tough upbringing and they never want to be poor again, or they have some other motivation that drives them. But the important thing about this kind of villain is the self-justification. They might have other aspects like the different morality, different motivations, different goals and so on that bring them into conflict with the characters. But what gives them depth is that justification. We can see this in moral systems, ethical systems, political and ideological systems, like Randian objectivism, which excuses radical selfishness by saying that it's better for everyone overall, which is why it seems to be favored by teenagers whose prefrontal cortex hasn't fully developed yet. Sorry, libertarians out there. But the point is that people can rationalize collateral damage or doing harm to others because they deserve it to be done to them, making differentiations between the deserving and undeserving poor, that sort of thing. If you think of people that you see as villains in the real world, then if it's not that they have a different morality or ideology, it's that they have a different motivation and they're willing to sacrifice more or less or different things in order to achieve that end. So these are self-justified villains, and they're perhaps the most satisfying. Context can change who is a villain and who isn't a villain as well. It can change how you view them. What the circumstances are can turn something that would be villainous in normal circumstances into something that is heroic in a different circumstance. If you enter into a life or death situation with a modern moral schema, you're probably going to end up in terrible trouble, and you may even, if it's an apocalyptic scenario, end up wiping out your own species. By way of example, I'll give two examples, one of which I've given before. There's a book called Galapagos, wherein a great disaster befalls the entire Earth, all the human race, except for a small group of humans who are in a yacht near the Galapagos Islands. And they land up there and try to survive. There is only one fertile male amongst this population, and he's very old and has no interest in perpetuating the species or doing anything else. So one of the female passengers effectively sperm jacks him and uses it to impregnate all the women who are the rest of the people who are alive to perpetuate the species. Now, is this a good or evil action? He's had his personal autonomy violated, he's been made a father against his will, but it perpetuates the human species, who eventually evolve into a sort of seal-like creature. That's how the science fiction novel ends. Right, so what is the good and evil here? What perpetuated the species? Is this woman good, or is she evil? The other example is one I've done before. From a certain point of view, Immortan Joe is the hero of Fury Road. Immortan Joe has formed an alliance with surrounding communities who he supplies with water and breast milk. And there's industry, there's trade, there's a stable population, there's plant growth going on. He's able to grow crops and so on. And he's even started a breeding program to try and eliminate the mutations brought about by whatever it is, toxic waste, radioactive fallout, so that the human species can survive. So here we have a potential new cradle of civilization. It's a harsh one. It's one that treads upon people's individual rights, but it seems necessary for the perpetuation of the human species. and does seem like the best place from which to launch a start on that. So he's not really a villain, if you take it from that point of view. The villain would be the people who come along and disrupt that and destroy any hope of the human race re-emerging from this new dark age, from that point of view. But they're acting with our modern morality, whereas he has adapted his morality to the post-apocalyptic structure. It's a bit tougher to deal with, isn't it? And it makes for a more interesting villain if you do think about it. There is no right way to do this. There is no right way to write a villain. Even the things people disparage, like the mustache-twirlers or the villains who do something horrible purely to establish their evil credentials, there's hidden depths to all of that. What makes a good villain mostly depends on your game and the moral and metaphysical structure therein. If you know your genre, then you know what fits. And when you really start to think about it, none of these villains really, except the mustache-twirlers, are villains in their own minds. Zhang.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?